IVM.
When we think of India's courts and legal systems, usually the last thing that comes to our mind is high tech. But the speed with which many of India's courts have responded to the challenges imposed by the lockdown and the current needs of physical distancing have been a welcome and pleasant surprise. Can we imagine a 21st century platform where criminal and civil justice is accessible to a much larger number of Indians, where a legal remedy is available for a much wider set of cases? Can a migrant worker who's been denied wages and mistreated, for example, truly be able to get the courts to intervene and deliver justice? On this episode of the Pragati podcast, Leah Varghese and Surya Prakash from Daksh India tell us how. Welcome to the Pragati podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pawan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. It really has been a great week this week. We've had two of our first international cricketers show up, people who have played for their respective sides. We had W.V. Raman come on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, you should be listening to that if you enjoy cricket. It's really one of the best out there. And you should also definitely check out Monty Panesar, who showed up on Cyrus Says. That was another really interesting conversation that occurred. If you haven't been listening to a few of our shorter shows, please do that as well. Ashish Vidyarthi has been doing a great job for us. We got 30 episodes now on Begin the Journey. I think you really enjoyed that show. If you haven't listened to it, it helps you with understanding what's going on in this tough time and how do you deal with it from a mental health perspective. We've also had some really fun stuff come up on the Smile India show. Shifa's been doing a lot of really good stories over there. Things would just make you happy, so definitely do check that out. And on the more serious side, make sure that you're checking out our regular shows like the Pragati podcast, All Things Policy. They're definitely going to keep you up to date on what's going on in this COVID world. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome to the Pragati podcast. I'm your host, Pawan Srinath. Joining me today are Leah Varghese and Surya Prakash, who are both at Daksh. Leah is the research manager and Surya is the program director. Surya is, of course, my co-host on Teleharte, and he's also been on the Pragati podcast earlier. Leah, welcome for the first time.
Thanks.
And Surya, welcome back.
Hi, Pawan. Great being back on the show.
Yeah, and it's odd for us to speak together in English rather than Konglish, right? But let's try and stick to English this time. We've had multiple conversations on India's judiciary before. Surya, you've come and spoken about the lower judiciary in the country and how important it is. We've also had Alok Prasannakumar come and talk about the Supreme Court in the past. We've had Harish talk about the Supreme Court in crisis as well. And today we want to talk about how to reimagine this, and we want to talk about some of the new work that you are doing at Daksh, which is on imagining a justice platform for the country. So my first question, Surya, to you is something that we discussed previously as well. Something very odd about the criminal and the civil cases and their numbers in India. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Absolutely, Pawan. I think India is one of the very few countries which has more criminal cases in its district judiciary than civil cases. You would expect that a country of this size and variety will have more civil disputes, but unfortunately there are more criminal cases, and there are many reasons for this. This criminal versus civil is not the same across the country. You will find that in the northern and the eastern part of the country, it is almost like 60% of the cases are criminal, while in the southern and the western side, there are more civil cases, possibly 60 to 70% are civil cases. So this geographical variation is also there. Another reason is also that there's a lot of criminalization of cases. So what could have been a proper commercial case, like a check bounce, has become a criminal case. Similar criminalization of offenses have happened over the many years now. So it's a very strange situation that our district judiciary has a lot more criminal cases than one would expect to see in a society like ours.
The takeaway here is not that we are a more criminal country, right, where there is more crime happening in India compared to other countries, but perhaps something that is fundamentally broken about filing civil cases as well.
Very much. So in civil cases, there is a chance to include your costs of not getting justice, not getting money, not getting rights to property or any other asset. Include it in your costing, have a workaround, have alternate arrangements. So therefore, people who come to the courts for civil justice is dropping. And this is, if you do a longitudinal analysis of the case data, it is showing that the civil cases are dropping. But having said that, it does not mean that our criminal justice system is the best or all cases are being reported. The data for crime rates are very susceptible to measurements and local institutions of measurement. So it's a very strange situation for us to be in.
Let's come to these civil cases, because to me, the idea of going to a court because of a dispute seems quite difficult, right? Now, it's true across the world that being dragged into court or going to court to seek a remedy is hard. I don't think anywhere in the world it's easy or it's, you get a lot of peace of mind by going to the court to settle a matter. Of course not. But in India, it feels so difficult. I want to maybe take a few examples and see how that works in our country. So we are recording this in, lockdown 4.0, 5.0. I'm bad at keeping track of which 0.0 the lockdown is in. One of the most tragic things we've seen in this country is the way migrant workers have been treated in India. So supposing there's a migrant worker, a formal sector worker, who are again a minority, maybe working in a factory here in Karnataka or in Bangalore, they have perhaps not been paid wages for a month or two, and now they have somehow managed to go back to their home state and their hometown. Can you tell us how they might have to go to the court to get their dues and get their salary?
The situation of migrant workers during this lockdown has been quite tragic. And as you mentioned, even in your hypothetical example, many of them have not been paid during the lockdown and for a few months before that. Now, in a situation like this, for them to actually be able to claim back wages from their employer through the civil justice system is going to be next to impossible, especially if they have gone back to their native state. Now, in a civil dispute, usually the jurisdiction is with the court where the cause of action has arisen. In that case, in your example, that would be in Karnataka. So the case has to be filed in Karnataka. Given current procedures, the person has to be physically present here to sign the wakalat, to sign the affidavit. He has to actually even be here to find a lawyer. In a situation where he's gone back to his native village in, say, Jharkhand, there is no way that he will be able to find a lawyer from there or be able to get together the documents, file the case. So for all those people who have not been paid wages during the lockdown and before, approaching the civil justice system is going to be actually the last resort. Most of them are not going to be able to approach the system at all.
Certainly. So let me then ask a slightly modified hypothetical. What if this is a migrant from some other part of the state? So now they're still here. Maybe they've gone back to Gulbarga. Can they file then? How crazy would it be for someone to file a case on this, even if they happen to be in Bangalore for that matter?
Yeah, actually, even if they're in Gulbarga, it's going to be very difficult for them because the way the justice system is designed currently, it's a very physical process, Hearings happen in a courtroom, all filings are physical. Although, of course, courts have tried to adapt during this lockdown and have introduced e-filing and video conferencing. But still, the worker who's in Gulbarga will still need to find a lawyer in Bangalore to do the filing, to make the arguments. So again, it's going to be very difficult. For the worker who's in Bangalore, okay, at least maybe finding a lawyer will be easier. But courts are still shut and they're hearing only urgent matters. So whether this is going to be classified as urgent, we don't know.
Okay.
So because of the kind of structure the courts have, which is very physical, and all the processes involve parties and their lawyers coming to a physical location, it becomes very difficult during such emergency.
Thanks, Leah. I understand that these are extraordinary circumstances, right? And all our institutions need to evolve. We can give them some leeway in saying there might be some time they need to come online and so on. But what if this was the summer of 2019? You're a worker who's working in a factory around Bangalore. You live in Bangalore. For some reason, there's a dispute, you have not been paid your fair wages. How difficult would that be? Supposing this worker found a lawyer, maybe their monthly salary is 10,000 or 15,000 rupees, and for getting, say, 30,000 rupees from their employer, could you give us a picture of what it would take for them to get it? And what might the cost involved be?
So the cost involved in litigation is not just the amount that you pay the lawyer. It's also the opportunity cost of you attending those hearings, you going to your lawyer, signing the papers. As you know, civil cases in India take an inordinately long time in courts. While all that is happening and the litigants are attending hearings, I mean, there is loss of income, there is loss of time. So for a dispute of, say, 30,000, I would say very few people would think of approaching the court. Most people would either try some kind of informal dispute resolution or they'll just write off that amount. I mean, this is a cliche, but the process is punishment, you know. You spend years navigating the web of civil justice, and then if it goes for appeal, then that's even more time. So most people would just write off that amount.
This might even be the same case if you are due to earn 3 lakhs, right? Because the cost and the uncertainty involved might be even more if you're someone who's earning that much and is due that much. And we don't even have a system of class action, right? So it's not like 100 workers who have all been denied wages can all approach the court together. Is that a solution even?
That could be a solution, but we don't have those kind of cases in India. I mean, we have PILs, but they are not actually like class actions. You know, those are more like public interest issues that are being brought before the court. We don't have the kind of class action suits that you have in the US, say in India. So for most cases, such as the example you gave of non-payment of wages or even, you know, non-recovery of dues, most people would opt for non-formal dispute resolution rather than approach the civil justice. And you need a faith that the outcome is going to be just. And that faith, I think people have lost.
So basically, there is no recourse under law and under the justice system for someone who's not earning too much and who needs their dues and they're not given them. And when you say informal measures, they can be anything and they're fraught with their own perils and risks, right? I mean, you might be able to approach somebody powerful locally. It might be a politician. It might be someone, but you are at the mercy or at the patronage of that person who might be able to help you, right? Or you might be able to get together and put some pressure as a union. But all of those sort of extra legal solutions also come with significant risks and significant uncertainties.
Absolutely. And apart from the risk and the power equations, there's also the problem of what is the law that these informal dispute resolution institutions are applying. I mean, are they applying the, say, the IPC or the Civil Procedure Code? No, a lot of times they are enforcing community norms or, you know, customary, I wouldn't even say law, but customary norms. And that, from a rule of law perspective, is quite a dangerous. But you can't blame people because the cost of going to these informal dispute resolution institutions is much lower than the cost of going to courts. And whatever the result is, it's going to be much faster than getting an outcome from the court.
So I think the reason why informal resolution mechanisms are favored is because of the certainty. There is an expectation, and most often it is stuck to that there is a quick turnaround time. It's either a yes or a no or something in between. Life goes on. You are able to take a decision without having to inordinately wait for decision one way or the other. And that's a big thing that makes people stay away from the justice system.
And the moment we go to an informal system, nobody is equal in that informal system, right? So if you are local, if you happen to belong to the right community, if you have the right network and the connections, you have a better shot at getting at least a fraction of what you are owed and what is due to you. But supposing you're again, this migrant worker who is now gone to UP or to another state and their hometown, you don't have those networks. You don't have even those basic privileges whereby you can demand for what is your right.
Yes, absolutely. These unequal power relations become much more stark when you go to these informal dispute resolution mechanisms. So, you know, whether it's caste, religion, gender, all these cleavages become much more important in these dispute resolution mechanisms. But yet people are choosing to go to them, you know, despite these problems. So that just shows that there's a huge trust deficit among the citizens when it comes to approaching the justice system.
Thanks, Leah. So far we've been talking about workers, and this is one example, and this is just one type of a civil dispute. Another that I think is quite common, and I've worked at nonprofits, I've heard many stories from startups and small vendors, is that the worth of a contract, be it an employment contract or any kind of a contract between two entities, is not worth too much in India when you don't have a legal recourse for this, right? So Surya, what happens when there's a company which delivers goods or delivers services worth a couple of lakhs to another company and they decide not to pay them back or not to pay them what's their due? Is it the same nightmare that we've been discussing so far?
It's a yes and a no, because most commercial contracts these days, if they are drafted by good lawyers, will have an arbitration clause, which will force the parties to seek an arbitration. Arbitration is outside the court system. You choose a person that both of you trust and say, this is our dispute. Tell us what you feel about it independently. Now, this arbitration system is also something that has to be strengthened, but it is, I would say, still getting there. Now, many times, there's a lot of dispute about who should be the arbitrator, with the dispute, questions under dispute, all of these things, and they end up in court. The court itself could appoint an arbitrator. It could be a vicious cycle again. In terms of civil disputes for commercial matters, it's slightly better, I would say.
Over here, can you give me a rough sense of a minimum ticket size of a payment or an issue which can even be settled by mediation? If it's just a couple of lakhs, do people just decide to not go for a legal option, be it arbitration or going to the courts?
So there is a mandatory arbitration clause now in almost all contracts that we say I accept, right? Without even reading through the whole thing. There is a difference in practice. In the US, this is very common, which is where we have inherited this from. But in the EU, for example, a mandatory arbitration clause is illegal. You can't force somebody to say you will only arbitrate here or in this forum. So what is the ticket size? Like how I said, every contract has it now. So people could, for example, in the consumer courts, where people, if your washing machine breaks down or if your television doesn't work, people can go to consumer courts for those things too. And we have seen that those disputes do end up in consumer court. So really, it depends on what is your staying power. Can you really withstand and move on? That is really what determines what is the dispute under that can be litigated or taken to higher levels.
And what about when you're in disputes with the government, Surya, whether you're a contractor, you're a subcontractor working for the government, or you're just a private company and you have to figure out GST and income tax? What happens then right now?
And I think the equation there is possibly same or not worse as the criminal matters, right? Where the state investigation agency is after you. Here, it's the state's revenue gathering agencies that are after you. If it's income tax, it's the central government. And if it's a GST, it could be either the state government or the central government agencies. So disputes there go to specialized tribunals who handle these kind of disputes. And these tribunals, if you don't quite like it, you can go to the high courts and later on. That is another mechanism that you could be stuck with if you run to the wrong side of the revenue collection agencies. And very real, given the aggressive revenue collection efforts that have been put over the last 2-3 years, and we are likely to see, given the revenue deficit due to the pandemic, etc.
So when we talk about tax terrorism, this is sort of what comes in over there, right?
Absolutely. That's the term we should use.
Okay. So apart from this, growing up, to me, the classical court dispute that would drag on for years and years were property disputes. There's an old house, there's an old piece of land somewhere, it's valuable, there are perhaps descendants who are fighting over it, there's an intra-family dispute, or it's a dispute where somebody's bought a piece of land and we don't know who used to own it and there are multiple claimants. Currently, how should we see these civil disputes on property and how are they being handled right now?
So actually, property disputes form a pretty large proportion of civil disputes. A lot of the disputes that are actually reaching civil courts pertain to property, whether it's partition, whether it's title claims. So yes, this is a very large volume of the civil litigation in India, and it's something that we really need to look at much more deeply. So it's not just a matter of people fighting over property, but there are underlying issues in terms of the way land records are maintained. There are problems with the maintenance of land records. We have very complicated inheritance laws. Inheritance laws are different according to your religion. So a lot of times, as you had mentioned, once the property becomes valuable, you have a lot of people who have a claim to that property. And a lot of litigation is around these disputes. And as with increasing urbanization, property values have really skyrocketed in Indian cities. That leads to a lot of litigation, not just among families, but there's also allegations of land grab, encroachment. We've inherited a lot of these systems from the British Raj, and we really haven't reformed them much.
Thanks, Leah. Here, we've been talking about e-governance outside of the judicial system with our governance systems for at least 20 years now. And we sort of know what kind of a mixed bag of success there is. But Surya, can you give us a bit of a picture on how the courts have looked at digitization? I know that there are e-courts websites and you can look up a few things online now, but how good is it really?
So what you see, what you mentioned, the e-courts website is the biggest progress that the digitization program of the judiciary that has happened over the last 10 years. Formally, the digitization of the judiciary started in 2009 with e-courts phase 1. It ran for 5 years and it got further extended by another 5 years as phase 2, which ended in 2019, extended by a year. So it will be ending this year. So it's been a mixed bag when it comes to digitization of the judiciary. What has definitely been happening is the case information. So who are the parties? Many times the lawyer details. When is the case coming up? When was it listed previously? The judgment itself. All these fields are available on e-courts and high court websites for us all to see. So when I say a mixed bag, what has not happened is the processes within the judiciary itself. So a filing you still need to go land up at the filing counter and hand over this docket with all these photostated copies and with chapa and wakalat, all of those things. So because this entry point into the justice process is physical, the entire chain had to remain physical. So the judiciary's e-courts phase 2 e-filing was one of the items that they were planning to do. Video conferencing was another thing that they wanted to do. These have largely remained unimplemented till the pandemic hit us. So far, it has been mixed results for the judiciary's digitization plans. Phase 3 is almost upon us, and we need to be really reimagining how technology can be used in justice delivery. I think there's this wonderful phrase by the author Richard Susskind, who is finding favor amongst many judicial leaders across the world, that the justice system is really a service. It need not be restricted to a place. Everybody knows that when they say justice, it is an outcome of a process, really. And what processes are followed are really immaterial to the outcome of justice. There is a need to think on those lines when we are thinking about phase 3 of the digitization of the judiciary.
Thanks, Surya, and thanks, Leah. So my takeaway from it is right now, the digitization efforts are only to the extent that you can sort of access what is going on with a case and perhaps in the courts online, but all the processes and the procedures where you have to go and submit something or take the next step, all of them are still currently physical. So let's take a quick break and we'll come back and let's talk about the work that both of you are doing at Daksh on imagining a justice platform that is not still paper and plastic and physical and being in the court location at all times, but can truly be something that we can imagine for the 21st century.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A-game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back to the Pragati podcast. I'm here with Leah Varghese and Surya Prakash, and we are talking about how broken the Indian judicial system is, how paper-driven a lot of it is, how inaccessible it is to most people. And we're talking about how to imagine a justice platform that is truly one that should be in the 21st century. Leah, my first question to you, we just ended before the break on how all the processes are still physical and perhaps at a location. So is the justice platform about digitizing all of this such that the whole effort is sort of paperless? Can you give us a sense of what that paperless system could be?
So here I'd like to distinguish between merely digitizing and transforming the justice system. So when we talk about digitization, that's the process of automating paper-based systems. So you take paper-based systems and you make them digital, you automate them, they become a little faster. But what we are imagining is actually a transformation of the justice system through technology, because technology enables us to do things that were not possible in the physical paper-based realm. It's not about like grafting technology onto paper-based processes. It's about rethinking the processes. I'll give you an example. So there's something called e-filing for pleadings in courts. Currently, the system is that pleadings have to be printed on legal paper, signed by the lawyer, the affidavit has to be signed by the party, submitted to the registry. Various copies have to be submitted. The registry scrutinizes it and decides whether it can be admitted. How people think of e-filing usually is that, okay, we will digitize this process, meaning we will scan the pleadings and email it to the registry. That is merely replicating a paper-based process through technology. What e-filing actually should be is that parties can file pleadings through smart forms. All of us have filed income tax returns through the e-filing system of the income tax department. So something like that can be created for the judiciary, which is an interactive form where litigants or lawyers fill in the details, and based on the responses, the system builds the pleadings for you. The system builds the document for you. So that is what transformation looks like rather than digitization.
So in that sense, what we're talking about is, when people sort of thought of cars as horseless carriages, right? But cars were more than horseless carriages. Even today, we talk of things as driverless cars, but it's actually automated vehicles. And the principles and the systems that apply earlier don't apply in the future. So just making something digital is just putting a new skin on it. Can you then paint a picture of what some elements of this justice system could be, which is truly either fully digital or hybrid?
Pawan, I think it is important to distinguish between digital courts and virtual courts, especially because during the pandemic and the restrictions there has been an increasing talk of virtual courts. Virtual courts strictly mean where everything is completely online. You don't even have to step out of your house to complete the case. You file your case online. When they ask you to appear before it to depose, to validate certain facts, you can log on to a platform where you do like a Zoom call or a video conferencing. The lawyer is also doing it from his office. Everything is completely online. That's a virtual court. Now, a digital court is where the information flow is digitized, which is your documents, your pleadings, your evidence. Those could be digital. So there's a distinction between digital courts and virtual courts. The other term that is very common these days is ODR, online dispute resolution. Again, online dispute resolution is just one form of virtual courts. ODR is mainly used for courts that don't want to be at any particular physical location. They are natively digital. So anybody could just log on and complete the dispute resolution. It is more used in terms of alternate dispute resolution mechanisms like arbitration, mediation, conciliation. So those are ODRs. What we are saying when we talk about a justice platform really is an enterprise level interface of everybody involved in the justice system, in the dispute resolution mechanism. So it could be the police, it could be the public prosecutor's office, it could be the forensic labs, the prisons, the government lawyers in the case of writ petitions, or it could be a tax matter. How could all of these institutions interact digitally so that there is a seamless integration of their information flow. The way I like to think about it is the justice system is an information ecosystem, like many other sectors are. The financial system could be one, the education system could be one. What sets apart the justice system is that there is a very strong hub in the form of the judiciary. So if you take the justice system, there are citizens, there are lawyers, there's the government, and there's the bedrock of the statute and the judgments, the precedents. All of these are information inputs that go into resolving the disputes. So this is an information ecosystem. There is a very strong player in the judiciary who act as an information clearinghouse, who take all this information and make sure that they go in the right direction. So it is possible to imagine this information ecosystem to be functioning on a justice platform. The e-filing example that Leah gave, when you're filing a petition, can your petition not be built up by questions that you're assisted by a tool which informs you of the precedents particular to your case, your jurisdiction, or your type of company, and these tools draw upon statutes, notifications, rules that are already out in the public domain, judgments, just as a very simple example. Or if you take the criminal side, if there is a bail granted to a person, there should be an immediate notification to the prison authorities that this particular person has been granted bail by this court. Seamless integration of information. Why is that not possible? A platform is an integration of all the players in the justice system. That is what we envisage.
Thanks, Surya. So I want to come back to some of the examples that we discussed in the first half. Maybe we can just pick one or two sample ones. Maybe let's go back to that not so hypothetical migrant worker who's gone back to their hometown. Under a new justice system, how would it be easier for that person to access a legal remedy? Leah?
So under the new system, the person sitting in Jharkhand or Bihar, wherever, logs into the platform. He describes his dispute. The platform also has a diagnostic function. So the platform will also inform him of what his options are, what his rights are. So he can choose whether to go to court, whether he wants to go for ADR. And then the platform will help him navigate the process. So if he decides to file suit, then the platform helps him, say, draft the plaint. It asks him, okay, where are you located? Where was the dispute? So then it tells the person, this is the court that will have jurisdiction. And it builds, as I had explained, it builds the document for the person through the responses he gives to the questions that the platform asks.
And even here, it is possible that you can have a physical intermediary, right? So it might still be difficult. Like, for example, even today, online filing of our own taxes is possible, but sometimes it's complicated enough that we do still take the help of someone who can take all of our documents and even enter things into the system, right?
Yes, of course. I mean, the role of lawyers still remains, but going back to the hypothetical example, he can hire a lawyer, say, in his own hometown.
Right.
The physical location doesn't become that important right now, because also processes are so local and peculiar to the state. It's very difficult for a lawyer in Jharkhand to file a suit in Bangalore.
Gotcha.
But once you have the platform, these kind of boundaries become less important.
Okay. So what happens then?
The outcome would be a machine-readable pleading. And that also reduces a lot of time that the registry takes in manually scrutinizing pleadings and finding objections, going back to the lawyer, asking him to correct the pleadings. All that time will be saved if you have a system of smart forms for pleadings. And that is what real e-filing looks like.
After that, in the justice platform, what happens?
So this is a claim for back wages. So once he files the pleadings, the next thing is the notice has to go to the opposite party. Now, in the current system, in the physical system, the notice is sent by registered post. In the platform, that will go by email to the opposite party so that he knows that a case has been filed against him. He submits his response again digitally. Then the next stage is evidence. So in a case like this, most of the evidence will be documents, say the person's appointment letter or whatever documentation the laborer has showing that he was an employee of this person. So that again can be filed electronically. There's no need to give physical copies in the registry. Then the evidence is usually subject to examination or cross-examination of witnesses. Now that we have video conferencing, that process can also be done digitally. So he doesn't have to actually come to Bangalore to be examined. He can sit in his village and through video conferencing, the lawyer in Bangalore can examine him. And then the next stage is usually arguments. We always thought that arguments were a very physical process, but in the last 2 months, we've seen that arguments have moved online and can be done through video conferencing. Once the arguments are completed, the judge has to decide and dictate the order. So actually, in a simple case like this, the entire process can be done online.
Okay. And it can be done perhaps within a short period of time as well, right?
Yes. Also, the scope for adjournments also becomes much less if you go online, because in an ideal system, like you are given a time slot and you have to appear during that time, and there's not much scope for asking for adjournments or delaying the case.
Okay.
If I may extend that further, Pawan, because in India, appeals are very common and rampant, assume for a moment that at the end of this, there is a resolution, there is a judgment that is given by this court. This judgment will come in the form of a machine-readable document that will be emailed to all the parties involved and the lawyers. It is also available on the platform, and the parties can choose to appeal it. If they feel that they are not happy with the outcome, it's just one click away and saying it will be appealed to the relevant court. That's a very simple thing. We will have to figure out the details of it, will have to be thought through more carefully, but the appeal process can be much simplified. The whole transactions of the lower court will be available for the higher court to go through and give a very quick decision. It can also be that at any point within the resolution, before the resolution comes, say, for example, there's an interim award and says, pay him 5,000 per month till this case is disposed of, right? Well, actually only 10,000 is due. That order can be appealed, which is called an interim order. That can be appealed to another, maybe to the High Court itself. It can go to a court that does not have the normal appeal jurisdiction. It can go to a special court under a writ or something like that. That can also be enabled. So traveling up in the hierarchy of courts will also become very easily possible when we think of the justice system as a platform.
Leah, we discussed an example here of something that could be resolved purely online, right? And perhaps within the span of a couple of weeks. There'll be many civil and criminal cases which cannot be done fully online. How do we imagine this justice platform which includes real-world investigations and more?
So the justice platform doesn't mean that all cases are going to be resolved online completely. So there is going to be a mix of online and offline. And as you had mentioned, there are certain processes that have to be carried on offline. For example, in criminal cases, the investigation has to be an offline process, interrogating suspects, forensic analysis, all these things. It's not possible to do all these processes online. But when you have a platform, all the stakeholders in the justice system can communicate seamlessly. So right now, what we have silos. For example, the police have their own system, the courts have their own system, the prosecutors, the prisons, all of them operate in silos which don't communicate with each other. So once you have a justice platform, even if some of the activities happen offline or happen in physical courtrooms, the communication becomes much more seamless.
Thanks, Leah. So, Surya, can you give us a few sort of guiding principles that you have focused on? Because this seems quite humongous, right? How do you start thinking about this?
Yeah, I think that is really the challenge. Where do we start building? But before we get to the building, I think the principles that we were guided by and which we have elaborated upon in our white papers on the Next Generation Justice Platform. The first thing is that it's completely citizen-centric. We want the process reengineering or the process reimagining or the justice delivery to be oriented towards the citizen because ultimately, he or she is what matters to the entire process, should matter to the entire process. The other guiding principles that we have agreed upon is modularity. Don't make all of this as one humongous enterprise software. It has to be modular for e-filing. It has to be modular for judgment pronouncement. It has to be modular for, say, case management. Break it up into pieces that can then talk to each other. How do these talk to each other? By adopting open standards. This is very critical for the success of this platform or any other large system. Open standards basically mean that the authorities who are in charge of technology for the justice system sit down and say, these are the standards based on which the modules will interact with each other. Once you have these open standards, then the APIs can be built by anybody. right? One of the things that seem very daunting when you look at a apparently monolithic structure is who's going to build this? Is the Indian state and its technology institutions capable enough of building something as transformative as this? The answer to that is really in open standards, where you enable private players, you enable solutions to develop which will follow these standards. Or as a corollary to that is open data, where all the data that you put out is also made available to the public, depending upon two things. One is institutional accountability, which is where as citizens, we want to hold justice system institutions accountable for their performance, which could be courts, it could be the police, it could be investigation agencies, and the others. But given that all of this data is now going to be online, very, very important that privacy is maintained. Again, there are nuances to it as to what data should be private, what should be in the public domain, especially because courts are supposed to follow the open hearing principle. The whole principle of trust in the judiciary is because it happens in an open court hall, right? But then how much of that do you really translate it into data available to everybody else? Which type of cases do you hide the names of the litigants or the accused? These are further nuances that we have suggested some principles for, but really modularity, open standards, open data, and privacy are what we are saying should guide the building of something as transformative as a justice platform.
This is going to be a marathon as well, right? This is not something that's going to be built overnight, maybe not even in a year.
I think starting small, making sure that there is rigorous testing is key to this building for the long term.
To me, the closest and of course a much simpler example that I can think of is something like the UPI, right? The plumbing is the same, but ultimately connected to existing bank accounts and so on. But I don't need to depend on a government provided Bheem app, but I can just use whichever provider that I want to.
That is possibly the closest analogy in the Indian circumstances. And I think we should understand how transformative it has been. In the US, for example, electronic transfer of funds can happen only during working hours, and see how quickly we are able to transact in India, right? Something like that, but this is possibly of a much grander scale.
Even when we take that UPI example, this still need to be linked to a bank, right? You still need to be linked to an incumbent from a small set of players who are there in that ecosystem. Surya and Leah, to do something this transformative, I'm guessing that this is going to upturn a lot of baskets, right? I mean, this needs a fundamental break from the status quo. And perhaps the ongoing digitization efforts have not been that much of a departure from the status quo, although I'm sure it has required the adoption of quite a few new things. So first, how do you get the government, which is perhaps the executive, and how do you get the judiciary on board to start something like this?
In the justice system, there is the judiciary itself, and there are other institutions at the state level and the union government level. So the judiciary itself, fortunately, has a very strong leadership that is committed to technological transformation right now, which has, in the wake of the pandemic, how the judiciary has responded to video conferencing, the focus given on e-filing. It has given us an indication that this is something that the moment has come right to undertake this long journey. What will now be left is for the state level and the union government level. How will other arms of the state respond to these initiatives when we are opening up and saying, you can now talk to us completely digitally. We are open to this seamless information flow. How will we respond? How will vested interests respond to this? How will leaders respond to this, both on the political side and the executive side? Nobody can call the trajectory here. I would say that taking small steps and allowing for people who want to take the step to take that step. They will always be leaders. They will always be laggards. The judiciary is a large, complex, adaptive system. You can't force it in any one direction, and that will only going to lead to more failures. We should allow for variation in adoption rates. We should allow for variation in conviction rates. Allowing for failure will make this more of a success is my sense of things. We are too vast a country to be really forcing one solution down everybody's throat.
And now what about things beyond the state, be it state governments, the central government and other players within the government setup? How about the bar and the legal fraternity, Leah? What barriers do you think we'll have to overcome over there?
we definitely foresee that there is going to be resistance from the bar and from lawyers, because this is such a different way of working. The traditional sense of lawyering is very physical. It requires presence in court. So this is a very different way of viewing the justice system for them. But I think that while implementing a platform, it's very important to carry the bar along, at every stage, ask for their feedback, get their inputs. If they have challenges, address those challenges. For example, a lot of lawyers have told us that they don't have laptops. So maybe have a provision for using mobile phones, or have kiosks in the Bar Association offices where there are computers that the lawyers can use. So whatever apprehensions the lawyers have, those need to be addressed at every stage of implementation. And we've seen digitization attempts in other countries fail because, stakeholders were not consulted and not taken along during the process. So that is very important.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Surya. I would like to ask both of you, what do you think gives you hope that you can see a transformation in some of these things in the next 5 years or in the next decade?
So what gives me hope is actually the speed with which the judiciary has responded to the lockdown in the last 2 months. So once courts were closed, a lot of courts have started initiatives for video conferencing, for emailing of pleadings. And this is a huge step forward for courts in India. So the speed with which they reacted, and the judges and the court staff have really gone beyond the call of duty to put the systems in place to make sure that access to justice is not affected by the lockdown. That really gives me hope.
If you take a larger social view, digital is becoming the norm. Everybody is comfortable with a smartphone. Phone is becoming integral to transactions that we do on a daily basis. You cannot have a justice system which is very anachronistic to these times. It is bound to happen that the justice system will change course to adapt to these growing needs. How much and how fast will be the only question.
Leah, Surya, thank you so much for joining me on the Pragati podcast. I really hope that a justice platform that is truly necessary for the 21st century will become a reality, not just in our lifetimes, but perhaps much sooner. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks, Pawan, for having us.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati podcast is available on the IVM podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.
नमस्ते, मैं हूं सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कुटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।